Yeah, actually she did the whole service today from there, so. We actually are live, she just told me, so there we go. Hello. Whew, I didn't say something I shouldn't. Anyways, welcome, and those of you who are peering in, I'll just kind of vamp here for a minute. It's great to have you here. This has been something that the vestry and I have been talking about doing for a while now, but just because it is one of those things that I think is relevant for everyone. And as I've mentioned many, many times, it is such a tremendous gift to engage in this kind of process for the sake of your family. I, as you might imagine, do about a dozen funerals a year. And I can just attest to you that having these things in advance makes the whole process so much easier, because it's such a tough thing to do, to plan the funeral service for someone you love. And being able to say, wait a minute, this is their favorite hymn, this is their favorite passage of scripture, it's just a real gift. Let me begin by saying that in the prayer book, it refers to this as the burial office, which has to be the least charming way to refer to it. Because half the time we're not even burying people, but because it's supposed to be a celebration of life. And I know that there are times in which there are really tragic circumstances of someone's death. And again, it's somebody who's done hundreds of funerals. Some of them have been nightmarish to the point where I don't even want to tell you the story. But in most cases, the goal is to celebrate the person's life as a blessing. That the people around you who know you and love you, your life made their lives better. In addition, we're also celebrating the fact that we are people of the resurrection. And so every time we do a burial office, I will talk about the fact that the person in question is enjoying the promise of new life and eternal life that is given to us by Jesus Christ. And so we celebrate both of those two things. And so the tenor most of the time tends to be a positive one. It's not one of these sort of maudlin, grim. I mean, the word funereal doesn't necessarily evoke sounds of like things being really chirpy, but we try to have a celebration every time we do one of these things. Now, when it comes to the planning for this, we actually do have a worksheet in the church office that has where you can mark down all these different choices that you can make. And so if you want one of those, please go get one, fill it out, and then make 3 copies. One copy you're going to give to the church, wherever it is the church that is that you're planning on having to do the service. The second you're going to give to a family member, and the third you're just going to keep on file in your home, because you may want to at times update it. And we're very happy to keep those on file. We're also happy to keep all the other documents like your living will and everything else here, because that way you know where to go. Your family knows where to go. So you're welcome to pick those up, and again, provide that documentation for your family and us both. I like duplications of efforts because that means that you're guaranteed to have it discovered somewhere. Now let's talk about where you might want to have your service. And I'm just going to say flat out that the answer here is Trinity. Unless you are planning on having your funeral be in a different place, your home parish in Maryland or wherever it is that you're going to, do it in the church. I don't want to besmirch the funeral home industry. I know there are people here who have family who work in the funeral home industry. They provide a very valuable service, but one service that you do not need to partake of is having your funeral at a funeral home. Have it here. One, it's prettier. Most funeral homes are kind of generic looking, but 2, this is your home. The only rationale that I can think of about why you might want to have a funeral at a funeral home is if you happen to have family who despise the church so greatly because they've been so hurt or whatever reason that they would not even set foot in there for your own funeral, then sure, pastorally you should have it at the funeral home instead, just a sort of neutral ground. But really, I just want to exhort you to have it here for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is, number one, we have a fantastic organ. Most funeral homes do not. You can have Eucharist here. You probably can't do that at a funeral home. And also, we don't charge you for doing funerals in the church. The use of the church itself is free because that's what we do as a church. The fees associated with funerals are always associated with like the organist or the cleaning crew or like renting out the parish hall for a reception. Even my fee is just an honorarium. It's not mandated. Charging for sacraments is what got the Protestant Reformation kicked off, so we're not doing that. But no, this is your home, and this is how we do. This is part of what we offer to our community for this. Now, you can also consider alternative locations, and I certainly have done funerals out in public places, in parks, in people's homes. I mean, there are lots of options there you might want to consider. There are lots of things, and I will, as a matter of course, be very flexible about this, because I can be. But I do just want to encourage you to consider doing it inside a church. That'll be all I sort of say about that. Now, in terms of the time and date, I mentioned this on my outline. I did, after I put it down, say, man, if I could tell you what time and day your funeral is going to be, that would be a cool trick. And obviously, most of the time, you don't know that in advance. But I will say, if in terms of what time, and this is a question that I often get asked, what time of day should we do a funeral? My answer to this is usually pretty simple. Do you want to have a meal afterwards with the people who are attending the funeral? Because if that's the case, if your goal is that you're going to have all of your guests come and have a shared meal together, then do it about 10 o'clock in the morning. Because that way you're going to have about an hour for the funeral, and then you're going to go in and have the reception, and you're going to eat lunch, an early lunch. If your goal is to just have fellowship like you might have at church, and then have the family gather for a meal, then do it about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Because in that way you can have the funeral, you can have the reception, you can do the interment, and then the family can go off and eat together. It all just depends on sort of what your plan is, or what your family's plan is about how they want to do it. And again, there might be exigent circumstances in all these cases, and I'll talk more about interments and those sorts of things later. As I say, it's probably not actually something you're going to plan too much of. But let's get down to the actual nitty-gritty. In the prayer book, there are, and you can bust it out if you want to. Yes, question, Reed, please.
The question I had was, in your experience, what is the proximity of the funeral to the death?
It has stretched out significantly in my recent experience because of two things. One was COVID, and two is the greater frequency of cremation. When I first started, cremation was sort of one of those things that was sometimes done, and now it is overwhelmingly done, largely because it's more economical. But so sometimes I would have it be happening, the following weekend or 3 or 4 days. Now I think it's become much more common to say we're going to do it, as in the case with Betty Hayward, whose funeral is going to be in May, because that's when the family can get together and everything. I'm sorry, I was asked to repeat the question. The question was, what is my experience about how soon a funeral is done? And again, it seems like it's more and more dictated because we as society our families are more spread apart now than they used to be, or a family would all live in the same area, that a lot of times it gets pushed back pretty far until such time as people can make travel arrangements to come in and be a part of it. So, and again, with a person who's cremated, you can kind of have them on reserve until then. And actually, by the way, that is also one of the many services that your church will provide for you, is that if you need to have your remains tucked away for a couple of months, we're happy to go ahead and squirrel you away until then. My grandmother was in my office for 3 months, just sitting there, waiting for her funeral because it was going to take place in Florida months later. And so, and I've had others who've had their remains dropped off, and we just care for them until such time as the service itself. Yes, ma'am. Right.
And part of it is there's a cremains, a scatter garden there.
Right.
And people may not do
I will, we do have the question was, a statement was, we do have a cemetery here, and that is accurate. I'm going to talk a little bit about interment near the end, but I do want to also say that is something that we do have as an offering to the community at large here. We do have a cremain section, as she mentioned. There are frequent conversations out there in the ether about a columbarium, which is one of those structures where you put lots of cremains in the same place. We don't have one of those, but let's just say that those are kind of one of those things that people wistfully think about in terms of the future. But let's look at the options themselves for the burial office. If you look in your prayer book, you will find 2 options. One is burial office 1, and one is burial office 2. And these, if you are wanting to follow along in your book, can be found. Look, my prayer book opened right to it. That's creepy. Can be found Burial Office 1 begins on page 469, Burial of the Dead, Rite 1. And Burial Office 2 begins on page 491. Now you may ask yourself the question, what is the difference between Burial of the Dead 1 and Burial of the Dead 2? And that's really easy. Burial of the Dead 1 is using equivocal language to Rite 1 Eucharist. This is the 1928 prayer book version of the Burial Office. So that's going to be these, thys, and thous for the entirety of it. Burial Office 2 is, again, the similar language of the Rite 2 Eucharist, which we refer to as contemporary English, even though it is now almost 70 years old. So, I'm sorry, 60 years old. So in any case, either one is fine. I would say that, again, as time goes by, I find myself doing fewer and fewer Burial Office 1s than 2s, because I think as a community we have phased out the use of Rite 1 as a Eucharist. We don't even do it here at this church at all, except for the rare times that I've invoked it. And so I tend to find that people will opt for Burial Office Rite 1 if the person has a particular sentimental connection to the Rite 1 Eucharist. So if you grew up always doing Rite 1 and you love Rite 1, then you may pick Rite 1 as your burial office. Now, I will point out that the problem with Rite 1 is, quite simply, is that it is archaic language. It also tends to be less inclusive in language, and being mindful of the fact that there are people coming to your service who are unfamiliar with the Episcopal liturgy, this puts a little obstacle in your way, or in their way. So again, Rite 1, if you really love Rite 1, Rite 2 is the more accessible one. Questions here in the back. Linda first.
A lot of people have memorized the 23rd Psalm in the King James Version.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore, Rite 2, that has the 23rd Psalm, is more confusing.
So what I would say to that, just a couple of things here, is that actually if you were to look at Burial Office 2, you may find the King James Version, I believe. Even if you don't, there is nothing stopping you from using the King James Version as you're reading. Because here's the thing, not only do you not have the King James Version of the Book of Common Prayer, you don't even have the New Revised Standard Version of the 23rd Psalm. You have the Book of Common Prayer version of the Psalms, because here in the Episcopal Church, we decided to do our own psalmistry. So, but I will say, and we'll talk about readings in a bit, you can pick a King James Version of a reading, psalm or otherwise, as your readings, even if you do Burial Office 2. Again, there's lots of more options than you might think in this circumstance. And so again, Burial Office 1, Burial Office 2, often one of the first choices people make. And I'm sorry, yes, you have a question, Walter.
You may be addressing this, I haven't looked through the list here.
That's right.
You're pushing Rite 1 and Rite 2. Are there alternatives to Rite 1 and Rite 2, and are they acceptable and used?
Okay, so I don't know if there has been a Enriching Our Worship version of the Burial Office. I'll have to get back to you on that one. I will say that if there is a version that is in a supplemental liturgical resource of the Episcopal Church, like Enriching Our Worship, the National Church has declared that all supplemental liturgical material now has the same authority or appropriateness or use as the Book of Common Prayer. So if there's a version out there that you'd rather use that is even more modern than Burial Office 2, then it is acceptable across the Episcopal Church. So, I mean, unless your priest is just really being obstreperous, and I'm not that guy, if there's another version you want to use, we can use that version. No problem at all. So speaking of which, when it comes to the officiant for your service, I will say that the canons say that I, as rector, have the right to officiate every service here at the church. In fact, you can't have a service here technically, according to the rules, if I'm not present. But here's the part where I myself do not hog the limelight this way, and so if you say, listen, I would really love to have this person who is a meaningful priest of mine, or is a family member, or something like that, and have them be the officiant, great. I'm a lazy priest. Go ahead and let them do it. I'm perfectly fine with that. I really want this to be something that is meaningful for you. But just know that I sort of have right of first refusal, for lack of a better word, even though I rarely invoke it. Also, people have said, can we have a person from another faith tradition come and be a part of the service? That answer to the question is yes. They may not necessarily be able to celebrate the Eucharist, depending on the denomination, because the Episcopal Church has sort of a checkerboard diagram of which denominations of the Christian Church we are okay with having celebrate the Eucharist. But since a funeral itself is not a sacrament, then there's sort of less anxiety about having non-Episcopalians participate in the service itself, because at no point in here are you actually doing a sacramental act unless you include a Eucharist. I'll be talking about that in a minute. So if you do, like I was just looking at one recently, somebody gave me a funeral plan and they said, I would really love to have this priest be the person who reads the eulogy. We'll talk about those in a bit. Well, of course that's fine, because that person knows you. It may know you even better than I do. And so I welcome that opportunity to have an informed voice be a part of that. So again, I have no skin in the game here and be like, I'm so offended they didn't want me to do it. No, this is a personal decision, and I totally understand that. I will pause here for a quick minute about this to say something about personal choices. I'll share a story from my own life. I pretty much share it every time I do a funeral planning. So my grandparents on my father's side, my grandfather was Methodist, and my grandmother was Seventh-day Adventist. And when they got married and had children, they made the decision to attend the Methodist church. And so my father was raised a Methodist. I was baptized Methodist. My aunt played the organ in the Methodist church. My grandmother passed away first. She died of ovarian cancer when I was in 7th grade. And my grandfather made plans to have the service at the Methodist church. But at that point, my grandmother had started going back to the Seventh-day Adventist church because they didn't have kids anymore, so they would just go to church separately. And I remember sitting on the front porch of their home right after she died, and the pastor from the Seventh-day Adventist church came and said, Paul, Zenith was a Seventh-day Adventist. You should have the service at the Seventh-day Adventist church. And Paul said, the only Seventh-day Adventist in my family is dead. We're having it at my church. And I really appreciated that sense that there is also a part of service planning that is for the living, and having a certain mind towards that. And so I would say, as you're thinking about planning these things, to say to yourself, it's not just about me and who I am, but also how is my family going to experience this? And so I actually just sort of really, it's really funny. You have these sort of moments in your life where you don't realize that you're going to invoke this moment professionally for the rest of your career. You're a 7th grader, but there you go. So let's move on. Let's talk for a minute about the Eucharist. Yes, question.
So, this is funny, but not funny. So, say that, so I'm going to live a lot more, and you're not hearing me when I live the door. You are. And I'm going to fly you in.
Back from retirement. So I will say, number one, that I'm perfectly comfortable doing that. I'm actually going to do a wedding at a church service in Lawrence, Kansas. But I will say that there's a certain hesitancy there depending on circumstance. When I first came here, like about 3 weeks after I started here, the husband of a very dear friend of ours in our church passed away very unexpectedly. And of course, my knee-jerk reaction was, I should go back. Because I love these people. I love her, the wife, the widow. And they even said, can you come and do it? And I had to say no, because there was a new priest there serving as the interim, and she needed to establish herself. And me continually sticking my thumb into the pie would have been very unhealthy for that. And it broke my heart, because unfortunately there was like 4 deaths, like in the first month and a half I was gone. I told the diocese, I said, listen, your interim should be a person of interest, because they're all dying at Trinity right now. The Trinity Lawrence, not Trinity here. But in that moment I said I shouldn't do it. Now it's been like a year and a half. And so the interim who's still there is a little more comfortable doing that. Now, in all cases, I also have to get permission from the bishop. So I contacted Bishop Bascom, who's not emailed me back, to say, can I perform a sacrament in your diocese? Because clergy can't just like roam around like we're the Texas Rangers dispensing sacraments all over the place. Like, no, you have to get the approval of the home diocese. But circumstances willing, that I've been retired for a while, it's been time, a new priest is established, they're very comfortable here, you pass away, and then you say, I'd like to have Rob come back, and the priest here says, you know what, great, I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to do it. This is my calling, so I'm glad to do that. Just know that there may be a circumstance in which the greater good forces me to not be a part of that. So, and to everyone who might be watching from Trinity Lawrence who had hoped that I would come and do that funeral and others, I hope you understand why that was the case, because it really was the loving thing to do. Let's talk about Eucharist for a second. Eucharist is the central act of worship in our faith tradition. I mean, that was actually established when the New Book of Common Prayer came out, 1970s, that Eucharist was the thing that we do together. And as such, it is theologically and traditionally appropriate to have a Eucharist at a funeral. Because after all, one of the many things the Eucharist is a foretaste of that heavenly banquet that we're all going to be participating in. And so as such, it's really fine, and in fact in the prayer book it even mentions the option of having a Eucharist be a part of that service. That having been said, I oftentimes may discourage a person from trying to have a Eucharist at their service, because that if you are in fact part of a community, a family for whom the Episcopal Church tradition is unfamiliar, the last thing you want to do is make people feel awkward at your funeral. I find this to be especially true if you are coming from the Roman Catholic tradition, because Roman Catholics get very confused at Episcopalian Eucharist because they're like, this looks super familiar, but I'm not sure if I can, to which I would say, of course you can. That's why I do that whole spiel every Sunday. The number of times actually that I've gone to a funeral, done that spiel, and had people come up to me and say, thanks for letting me know that everyone's welcome at the table because I wasn't sure. I will always do that spiel. But some people may say to themselves, you know what? The last thing I want is to have a Eucharist and have 8 people from the entire congregation come up because they're the only ones who want to or understand they can have the Eucharist. That just looks weird, and it's, again, you don't want to have that moment where people are like, I don't know what's going on here. I feel uncomfortable. You don't want to feel uncomfortable at a celebration. So, again, also too, for whatever reason, if you're in a rush, and sometimes people are, number of people said, listen, I want as short a service as possible. Like, keep it snappy. Nobody wants to hang out there a long time. This is absolutely true. People are like, can you get it to 20 minutes? Yes, I can get it to 20 minutes. Don't do a Eucharist. It'll lengthen it out. A burial office with a Eucharist is going to be an hour. I'll just tell you that one right now, free and clear. But again, the priest in me says that a Eucharist is the right thing to do. The sensitive person in the world outside says, you may want to think about it. Questions about that at all? By the way, just in case you're curious, it's oftentimes a good idea that if you're doing burial office 1, you might as well do a Rite 1 Eucharist. If you're doing burial office 2, you might as well do Rite 2 or enriching our worship. That seems to make it sort of hang together thematically that way. Questions about that at all? These are, again, now imagine for a moment that I'm haranguing your spouse or your children to say, hey, do you want a Eucharist or not? And they're like, I'm grieving right now. These are the reasons why we do this in advance. Readings, which is by far the most complicated part of planning things in my mind. If you look at the burial office, it will tell you that you can do Old Testament, Psalm, New Testament, Psalm, Gospel. That is not true. That is merely a recommendation. You can have any permutation of readings that you want to. If you want 3 readings from the Old Testament, great. If you want 2 Gospels and a Psalm, great. If you want whatever, it's like ice cream scoops at a store. You can go ahead and put as many different kind of scoops of whatever kind you want in there. The point is, pick ones that mean something to you. And you don't even have to go with some of the old chestnuts. I know, like, for example, in the prayer book, all 5 of the readings are from the Gospel of John. Because the Gospel of John is when Jesus is really like, I am the good shepherd. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. In my Father's house, there are many. Those are the powerhouse, very appropriate. Hear them all the time at funeral readings, and I picked out one of those for my own. On the other hand, if you were to say, listen, the Beatitudes have always meant something really to me. I'd like to have that reading. Great. Go for it. I had a person who I did a funeral for who was a huge wine connoisseur, like he wrote for wine magazines. All of his readings were about wine. He picked like the Psalm, the Old Testament, all of them mentioned wine in some context in the readings because that was just how he was celebrating his life's passion that way, and it made total sense. I had a person who was a church organist who picked nothing but readings about church music, about how people were, in the Old Testament and the early Hebrew, people were given the gift of music and other ones like this. If you have a favorite passage, go with that one. Now, I will say that some of the readings do sometimes lend themselves, like if I have to pick, I tend to look at the circumstances of their death and think about what that might be like. So for example, if this is the case where you have lots of family who really love you, saying in my Father's house there are many dwelling places, always speaks to me about the fact that we're in community after death. If you are a person who experienced a lifetime of hardship and suffering because of chronic illness or something like that, then the passage from the book of Revelation where they say they will suffer no more or hunger or thirst no more, and talks about how those who are experiencing the resurrection will be free from all pain, that would make sense to me. So looking at them and saying, does this speak to my life, my situation, my faith, my story? That's all that matters. And you don't have to pick out one of every single one. Just go with a list. And you can do as many or as few as you want. You want one? Go with one. You want 6? Go with 6. Just know that it might be a longer service. Yes? So that's a good question. I was going to get to that. So I know that sometimes people have a poem or something else they like to have read. And I approach this judiciously because some things are not appropriate for the church context. Some things are a little treacly in this regard. I'm open to it. Just I ask you to, the 11th commandment for Episcopalians is thou shalt not be tacky. And so I think you just want to look at that when you're thinking, you didn't know that one? I heard that when I was a kid. My parents preached that to me my entire life, thou shalt not be tacky. That you consult with the rector about it. Sometimes if it's something like, if you're this is also true of music, by the way, if you want to bring in music that is outside of the sort of typical canons of the church, this is also one where you might want to talk about it, and just remember that, much like weddings, there's always a reception to follow where some of that might sneak in. But again, I tend to be a little bit more on the flexible side. I was in a university town, and the number of times we played the KU or K-State fight song at the very end of a funeral, I could probably more than on 2 hands. So anyways, but usually I kind of put it near the end, not during the gospel. Anyways, so yeah, so it's an option.
So we don't have to stick to the readings that are in the Bible?
Absolutely not. I mean, yeah, you can pick out those are not only these. No, if you want to do whatever story, if you want to talk about the prodigal son because you had a life where you were engaged in dissolute living and then found your way to Jesus, or whatever it might be. I said the Beatitudes is the one I tend to start hearing a lot more of these days because I think it's just kind of come into its own in a lot of ways in the church consciousness as being a good option, in the same way that also I sing a song of the saints of God seems to start showing up a lot more funerals these days. Keep in mind, by the way, that one of the things that you might do is if you're ever at a funeral or a church service and you're like, I really like that, you should get out your phone, make a little note, go back to it. Because every once in a while I hear a hymn and I go, that could sound good at my funeral. Also, thinking about who the readers might be for this. And there are circumstances where I've had people plan a funeral and they asked somebody to be a reader and the reader couldn't make it or they'd already died or something like that. And that happens, I get that. But you might ask yourself the question about who might be a reader. And a person reading at a service is a great way for a person to participate in the funeral especially in lieu of doing a eulogy. So if you know someone who maybe is uncomfortable with public speaking, and I'll get to eulogies here in a second, but would love to be a part of it, ask them to be a reader and put it down on your plan that you'd like to have your niece, your grandchild, or whoever, your best friend, be the person who reads at your funeral as a way of them being able to be a part of it. Eulogies. I have very mixed feelings about eulogies. I have more than mixed feelings about open mic eulogies. I don't like them. And I will tell you why. I had a family member whose husband passed away. They had an open mic eulogy, and a man got up, went to the microphone, and said that the deceased had had an affair with his wife. And this is how he was going to choose to, he was literally intentionally vilifying the deceased in front of his family. I wasn't there for this. If I was, I might have stopped being Father Rob and started being the Slam of God again. It was just horrific. And I'm not saying that you should not do it because you're all having affairs, but just realize that an open mic is an unfettered communication platform. And so I know some people really like it because they think it's going to be like some sort of fun, like this is your life kind of thing. The other part is that I've also been to the funerals personally. One of the first ones I ever did where nobody came up. They're like, anybody want to say anything? And it was like dead silence. And finally this one woman gets up and comes over. I swear to God this is true. And she says, hi, I was Hobie's hairdresser, and he had really great hair. And he tipped really well, and I'm going to miss him. And that was it. That was the only person who came up for the open mic. It was just ghastly. Oh, I have so many stories about that funeral. Oh my gosh. Sometime I'll do a whole comedy bit on the Hobie's funeral, the first funeral I ever officiated. But the reason to have a eulogy is a very simple one. One is that you have somebody who really wants to, who you trust, who really wants to share stories about this. And if it's meaningful for them, fantastic. The other reason might be, and this is also one of the rare occasions where I sometimes even encourage it, is if this is a person that I don't know, or whoever the officiant is. Now I'm trying to get to know you as best as I can sometimes, and don't think I'm not making notes about your funeral eulogies when I talk to you. But I will say that if somebody passes away and they're a stranger to me, I'm more inclined to talk about somebody coming up and saying a few words, because then they can speak authoritatively about them. I did have a funeral once, I might be full of funeral stories now, where I did a funeral, was at a funeral home, for a woman who had been a member of the church but had not been there in a very long time, and I did not know her from Adam's house cat. So I do what I always do, I get up there and I say that Jesus loved them. And so after the funeral, this little lady comes up to me and goes, "Did you really mean what you said about her?" And I was like, what part? She goes, the part where she's in heaven. And I was like, man, this woman's throwing shade at a woman's funeral. What do I not know about her? And it turned out that she was this woman who had estranged everyone in her life, and everybody hated her and whatever else. And it was I just didn't know. Now, I still feel comfortable saying that Jesus loved her, because that's still true. But, if I don't know the person, then I'm a little more inclined to let somebody who's more knowledgeable about them speak. But really the other reason to not do it is that it is an emotionally grueling thing to ask someone to do. Even I, a professional person talking in church, I did the eulogies for 2 of my grandparents. It was tough both times. I struggled more with those homilies than I have in any other one in my career, because it's personal. And in those moments, I want to be on this side of the rail. I don't want to be over here. And so just think about and asking people, is this something that they're going to be able to do the emotional work to be able to do? Or just let the professional person who you've gotten to know well say something instead, because I hear he does okay. Strictly above average. Now, I will say that's the difference between a eulogy and a homily. So even if there are eulogies, I will still preach a homily. And the difference here is that eulogies tend to be focused on lionizing and talking about the individual. The homily will cover more ground. I will, as always, talk about Christ, Christian faith, resurrection, I will recenter ourselves, regardless of where the eulogy went, to talking about the spiritual component of this whole practice. I will sometimes talk about the individual, oftentimes do. But the homily itself is essentially a sermon, where this is an opportunity for me to talk to people pastorally, comfortingly about their faith and say, hey, listen, this person's not gone, they're still alive, we still feel them, we still connect with them. Those are all things that I commonly talk about at a funeral. But I always do a homily. Questions about this? We're kind of moving through the section of the actual liturgical part of it. Any questions about any of this so far? Not losing anyone.
I have one question.
Yes, ma'am.
In the Episcopal Church, is there only one person who can be a
No, you can do multiple ones. Yeah, I've had people who've done 2 or 3 or whatever. Again, sort of be judicious about that. But yeah, but the open mic thing, like I said, that gets treacherous sometimes, and those can still kind of go on. I'm sorry. The question was, again, repeat the question. The question was, in the Episcopal Church, can you have more than one eulogist? And the answer to the question is yes. You can have no eulogist. Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, actually, I encourage it. That's sort of, from my mind, like the optimal situation is to have your priest know who you are really well. They can talk about you authoritatively and meaningfully, and perhaps share, something special about you in your service, and then talk about Jesus. Like, in my mind, that's the best option, because that way you're not pushing a eulogy on somebody. But again, if you want to do it, or if the person wants to, great. If not, don't sweat it. James in the back.
Well, to go around eulogies, this might be a time to plug this, if you don't mind. One of the most frustrating things about being a member of Trinity is that when someone dies and you read your obituary, it's like, oh my gosh, I had no idea we lived in LA together, and it's like, why do you have to wait? So could you write your obituary? Because when we're all on LinkedIn, we all have our profiles up and we look at it. That date isn't here yet. So if you write your own obituary, in a sense, you kind of preempt the need necessarily for a eulogy to get people up to speed with the past memory.
And a lot of times, again, there are parts of people's stories people don't know. Like I did a funeral once for a woman who I knew, and it turned out that she was the first female Secretary of Geology for the U.S. government or something, and you're like, I had no idea. So no, that's very helpful as well. Just don't put in like, I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die. Anyway, so pop culture reference. Yes, sir.
If you don't know the person that died, do you take personal information from family?
All the time. Yeah, if I don't know the individual, I go out of my way to make sure that we have one or more conversations about the person. And I usually talk a lot about, tell me about them, tell me a story about them, tell me what kind of person they were. Because you tend to find certain threads about a person's personality come out in the stories that are done. But yeah, no, I very rarely, I will do everything in my power not to walk in cold. Just again, because then I will also, though, not pretend like I know the person. Like, I won't be up there and be like, you know what, Jill was fantastic. And you're like, you never even met Jill. Like, I'll say I don't know Jill, but the stories that I hear about her was that she was a fantastic cook and a great teacher and loved gardening, or whatever it might be about her. But no, I always make time to meet. I usually meet with the family regardless, just because it's good to kind of have that interaction in advance, and if I don't know them in particular. Quick thing about flowers. A lot of times we will ask people if they wish to procure the flowers, or the family wishes to, or if the church, if you, both are again acceptable. If you want to say, hey, church, provide me with flowers, do the flowers yourself. I mean, we have relationships with all the florists in town. Our parish administrator is a florist. Like, we can take care of that for you. We will oftentimes say, can you please let us know what a budget is for this? Do you have favorite colors? Do you want something that's seasonal? When I was in Kansas, everybody wanted sunflowers. So, like, what are some things that you might like to see in there? And then let very creative people do a very fantastic job. On the other hand, if you're like, you know what, we'll take care of it, and family members go and contact the florist and say, can you put this together? Sometimes that's some nice busy work to keep people occupied. But either one of those is an appropriate thing. Yes, member of the Floral Guild, what would you like to say about that?
If you want the flowers to stay for the church service following, please tell the flower guild.
Yeah, so the question or the statement was, if you'd like to have them remain for the following Sunday or the following, to let us know. And that's very appropriate. A lot of times people sometimes will have them dispersed amongst the family. They'll go to the graveside. I will say the one thing that sometimes people think of, and it turns out that my experience has been that this is less well received, is people who say, why don't you take these flowers to a local retirement home? And every retirement home I know is like, no, we hate that because we all know why these flowers are here. It means that somebody's kicked it, and we don't need to be reminded of that in a retirement home. So it's not always, but I will say leaving them for the church service on Sunday is actually a great option for that. And again, just think about what your own preferences are. Sometimes people have flowers that are really meaningful for them, and so they want that to be a part of it. Music. Now, Tim's going to do a whole thing on music next month, but I just want to say from a liturgical planning portion of this, he's going to talk about great music selections. I'm going to tell you right now where you can have music. Anywhere. There are so many options for where you can stick a piece of music. Before the service, opening hymn, in between readings, before or after a homily or eulogy. Sometimes I've done the thing where it's like, let's just take a moment to reflect on the person while this music plays. During the setup for communion, while people are taking communion, at the end of the service, you could pick 9 hymns and we will find a place to put 9 hymns in the service, and we'll have a great time singing all of them. So you have carte blanche and a lot of flexibility about picking. Now you might say, I don't want any music at all. All right, great. That's also an option. I mean, it's not my favorite, but you can do that. But you don't feel like you'd be like, oh, I can only pick 2 hymns, and I really want this one, but I also want these other 2. No, have as many as you want. I myself personally would say there are some hymns that are perhaps overdone a little bit. Amazing Grace. And then there are lots of great options, and Tim's going to talk about them. I myself have every intention of having my final hymn be Come Ye That Love the Lord, because it's such a good, punchy little get up and go kind of song, and I want that at the very end, so people are going to walk out of here triumphant and go start preaching the gospel on street corners, and that's what I want for that one. So I will say, just as a small side note, I've started seeing a lot of, For All the Saints, and I sing a song of the Saints of God have shown up a lot in funerals lately. I don't know if it's just kind of like people have just heard it recently, but we're talking about sainthood and the deceased, it seems like it's been kind of a thing. Plus also, sing a song of the Saints of God is one of the 2 most British hymns ever. Yes?
It seems that with regard to music, you are offering only from the hymnal.
Oh, no, again, there are options. I mean, hymnal, Levos, or even, the Salvation Army hymn. And again, it's about appropriateness. I mean, it's a religious context. And the only thing I would say is that if you have songs that have no religious context, I may approach them carefully. And if you have songs that are completely inappropriate for a religious context, like I Got Friends in Low Places by Garth Brooks, then, I might say, no, save that for the reception. It's one of the reasons why we never do, by the way, in case you ever want to know, for weddings, the other big planning event, we never do the bridal march from Lohengrin. It's banned in the Episcopal Church. It's because it's from an opera that's a pagan myth. And we're like, you know what, we're not doing pagan myths in the church, I'm sorry. Plus also it's overused. So, think about those sorts of things. But no, we're classical music pieces, jazz, whatever it might be, as long as it's appropriate for the context.
And so you say classical music, and then you said another.
Jazz. I mean, I did a jazz radio show in college, so I think jazz.
I have been on occasion asked about using canned music as opposed to the organ or piano.
So we can do canned music, which, particularly if it's a piece that is not organ or piano appropriate. I have, there's the thou shalt not be tacky part of me that's a little bit like that. The other thing about canned music is, especially if you're doing if you want it at the beginning or the end or somewhere as a communion piece, a good organist can really run something out or clip it. So if you have a piece where it's in a circumstance where the time that you may need may be a little fungible, having a live piece makes sense because Tim can get up here and noodle for whatever. I went to a wedding once. They divorced, so maybe that's why I thought that. But anyways, went to a wedding once where they had this component of it, and they decided to do a pop culture song. I forget who it's by. While they were doing it, they were doing the unity candle lighting, but anyway, so they're doing the unity candle lighting, and when they got done with it, they just shut the song off. So the guy's like, I love all your they just cut it, and you're like, okay, well, if it was live piece, you could kind of bring it down when you need to bring it down. So just something to think about in terms of canned music is that live music has a certain verisimilitude that canned music does not. Yes, question.
So, coming from the Roman Catholic,
Mm-hmm.
you always had a singer, you know, they would hire a singer.
A soloist, wherever, yeah,
But one funeral that I have attended here was Kim's God.
right.
That didn't happen. I don't know,
So they're not mandated. The question was about soloists. And what I would say is that if you want to have a soloist or an instrumentalist, Tim knows everyone. And so if that's something that you want to have, Tim will probably be very happy to help set that up, either in advance or of the day of the funeral. We don't mandate that you have to have a musician be present as part of the service. Again, that's a matter of personal choice. We've certainly had string trios at funerals. We've had guitar players. We've had soloists. We've had all variety of different kinds of musicians that are up here. We've had people play the piano. I've been at church services where there were all sorts of different musical ensembles as part of it. And sometimes even members of the family who, again, want to participate would sing a song or play something as part of the service. And that's all entirely appropriate. And again, you can set it up however you like. I did mention in here about what kind of music is appropriate or not, and I will say that the rector has the final decision on this. Actually, that's in the book that I do have the final say. I don't exercise it a lot. I trust Tim's discretion in this regard, but if the priest comes to you and says, "I'm really sorry, we can't do it," don't be like, "Well, I want to talk to your manager." No, unfortunately, I got the final say on that one. Questions about that? But again, the February Adult Forum, I've asked Tim, I think we're going to do it I think if we don't do it in here, he's definitely wanting to play some pieces for you, and so to give you some ideas of there's some great pieces out there you may not even have thought of. In my heart, what I really want is some sort of weird funeral medley where he like plays like a bar and then he switches to another one. We'll see if I can make that happen. Receptions. I always recommend them. Always. And the reason why is quite simple. Funerals are gatherings of people who want to express their love to the deceased's family. And having an opportunity to personally engage with them and do that, it's also a great time to share your favorite story about a person, especially if that story is not appropriate for the context of a church. It's just a good time of fellowship. I actually think Frank Kirkpatrick, who is my professor at Trinity College for Religion, he was also an Episcopal priest, wrote a book where he said that he actually thought that the fellowship hour was the real conclusion of the worship experience. That it was just organically part of the whole thing to gather together and have that relational interaction with each other. And as people, I've been to churches where they didn't do it and it feels empty. So having a chance to do that, we have people here who will help facilitate a reception if need be. A very simple one. Like if you just want cookie and coffee, we can make that happen. If you want something more elaborate, we can obviously recommend caterers or whatever in the area as well. There is a fee for using the parish hall, but it's not expensive. But I would really encourage you to do it. The other thing is about it. And again, that's something where you can say, the family's going to do it, church should do it. Think about what you might want to have happen. And again, it's also about timing. Interment. When should you have the interment? Well, there's several options here to consider. Now, some people, you could be interred before the service begins. So you could go, have the family do the interment, come to the worship service. That works. You don't have to have the body physically present. You can also have the service, go to the interment, go to the reception, which makes sense if the place where you're interring is nearby, like the cemetery up the hill. So you go here, do the interment, come back and relax. You could also have the service, do the reception, and then in that sort of like, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here sort of hint to the people, leave and go and do the interment, and that's how you let everybody know it's time to go. Any of those things are good options. And it really is, again, sort of a matter of like what kind of plan you're having about the meals and everything else, where you're being interred. A lot of people nowadays are being interred somewhere else other than locally. So the funeral's here, but you bought a grave site in Maryland, and so that's going on there. Also, just for the record, if you are planning on having an interment, it is my pleasure to contact the local Episcopal priest to do the graveside service. That's not an imposition, that's what we do. I get calls all the time. Can you meet a family in the cemetery and pray a few words for a body that they're going to put in the cemetery where they had the funeral back in California or wherever? Happy to do it. And they're going to be happy to do it. No one's going to say no. Always a chance to serve people in a time of need. So if you are being interred elsewhere and you would like to have a graveside service, ask me and I'm happy to reach out to the person involved and say, hey, whoever the local priest is, can you go out there and be a part of this? And they're going to do it without question. The other thing I want to say about interment is there are lots of creative ways in which to disperse one's remains. And I'm thinking more cremains this way, not an actual body in a casket, because dispersing it in different ways would be kind of weird and probably involve a wood chipper. But anyway, but remain, that's a Fargo reference if you don't get it. Anyways, cremains on the other hand, there's some possibilities there with that I've seen a lot of people exercise. So a lot of times people will have remains put in the place of where they're going to be interred like a cemetery, but then part of the remains are scattered at their favorite park. Just make sure that you check with local ordinances about that or be very sneaky. Or like, I'll tell you a favorite one of mine, and I tell the story just because of the fact that I may in fact completely steal it. There was a woman who died. She had 5 children. She had, in her estate planning, she had half of her ashes put into the columbarium, and then the remaining half divided by 5. So 1/10 if you know your fractions. And gave each one of her children a inheritance that was earmarked for a trip. And she said, I want to go on one last trip with you. You go wherever you want and leave me there. And I was like, I was like, okay, I mean, that was such a great, neat way to because she loved to travel with her children. This was part of their life together. And I was like, you know what, it's so nice that we have that option to do some things like that. You can also have your ashes mixed in with concrete and then get embedded into a coral reef to help build up a coral reef. They have ones now where you can have your ashes put in a sort of potted seed thing and plant it in the ground, and then it becomes a tree. You can even have your ashes, the carbon in them, superheated and compressed and have a diamond made out of them to be worn by other people or shot off in a firework. Or, I mean, there are lots of things. I would not want to do the diamond. That diamond thing seems weird to me. Like, hi, what are you wearing? Oh, my Uncle Phil. It seems very strange. But there are lots of scenarios, and some of them are actually meaningful. So don't feel like you might say, but wait a minute, if I'm over here and I'm over here, how am I supposed to experience the resurrection? God will handle it. Don't worry. God can take care of it. God will gather you all your pieces up for the final day. Don't worry about it at all. And also, finally, consider the possibility of donating your remains for organ donation and medical research. Particularly if there is something extraordinary about your medical condition. Medical students, doctors, researchers all rely on the generosity of people donating their bodies to science to be able to advance our understanding of how the body works and become better healers. And so, and what's more, they will in turn also do the whole, they'll return the body to the person in question if you want, or handle the burial themselves. There's lots of tweaks to that, but just consider doing it. It's a real gift, and especially make sure that you have filled out your organ donation card and let your family know your desires about this, because I know people who have had their lives enriched because somebody was willing to donate their organs, and I'll tell you right now, you don't need them. You don't need them at all. How many of you guys ever seen the movie Jesus of Montreal? Anybody ever see this movie? Oh, go get it. Go get it. In the very end, it's about a guy who's an actor, and there's the ending scene. I want to ruin it for you, but there's this whole montage of one person who passes away, and it turns out that he's like O positive, and so he's like a very option for organ donors. And it's the whole end of the movie are people like taking off these bandages, being like, I can see, and it looks like the gospel, and it looks miraculous, and you can do that for someone. And so I know people are like, oh, it sounds really creepy. You know what? You'll be fine. You won't even care, I promise. I promise you won't care about that. But it could be a real gift to someone. If you don't want to do it, that's fine, I'm not going to shame you. But just think about it. Questions about that? You know what? So here's the thing. There are certain organs that can still be used. I mean, you think about like skin for burn victims. You think about the fact if you have functional livers or eyes or whatever, hearts. I mean, even if you are aged, it's still a possibility. And again, like, and then you don't know how old you're going to get at that point. So, but just have it as an option. And if they say, you know what, I'm sorry, this person died of cancer and we can't use the organs for that reason, that's fine. At least you tried. Plasma. I mean, there's all sorts of things that can be taken. So, anyways, other comments or questions about that? Yes, ma'am. So the question is, who's the contact person regarding the cemetery? That would be Denise in the church office. She'll get you pointed in the right direction. The cemetery is a beautiful, wonderful place. I spend a lot of time there almost every day. It's a gorgeous area. It's definitely a restful, scenic place to spend your final, and to be present there, to allow people to come in. I won't say like for you to be present there because you're not there, you're enjoying the resurrection, but for people to come and celebrate your life and reflect on you and be close to you. So, other comments or questions about that? Yes?
If we have a service for a family member and it's a very small service,
Mm-hmm.
do you recommend it being in here as well? Or
Not necessarily. I've actually done several funerals in the chapel. As a smaller worship space, it makes more sense. I'm trying to do a lot of more services in the chapel, as it turns out. So if it is a very small affair, I might suggest the chapel as an option. Again, we'll do it here. It doesn't really matter. I'm very flexible, but the chapel is definitely a scenario for doing a service. Other comments or questions? If you get home or if you're watching online, you're like, wait a minute, I forgot to ask him about this, please reach out to me. I'm very happy to do this. Again, take the form home with you, think about it, talk to your family, and really, again, thank you for this time, and I will look forward to seeing you next month. And then the one after that, the third one, is going to be about estate planning and legal documents, medical powers of attorney, the sort of secular side of planning your death. So that's going to be number 3. But next month, we'll be talking about music in the service, and I look forward to that. Thank you all again for your time. Those of you watching online, bless you all. Thank you. And if you didn't copy the handout, let me know. I'll be happy to make you one. Yeah, it is.
My father-in-law was head of the alumni affairs at West Point, and the story is that they would often get calls about funerals.